if you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains. You already know, folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I wasn't searching for solitude out of some romantic longing the way poets write about it. I was 34, a burned-out high school history teacher from Ohio, and all I wanted was silence. After a messy divorce and the endless chatter of students who thought TikTok jokes were philosophy, I needed air that didn't reek of fluorescent lights and cafeteria grease. When a friend mentioned an old hunting cabin in the Cumberland Plateau, half-rotted, dirt cheap, and so remote the Postal Service didn't even bother, I sold what little I had left worth selling and bought it outright. No forwarding address, no emails, no ties, just gone. The drive there was long and mean. Asphalt gave way to gravel, gravel gave way to mud, and eventually even my rust-bitten Subaru couldn't manage. The last mile and a half I had to walk, backpack digging into my shoulders, sweat sticking my shirt to my back despite the crisp October chill. The trees were the tallest I'd ever seen, straight pines and ragged oaks whose branches knitted together like cathedral rafters. The cabin didn't appear until I was practically stepping on it. Hidden behind a crooked line of hickories, it was barely more than a shack, a single room, sagging roof patched with tin, a soot-blackened stove, and a cot that looked like it had seen 3 different wars. No power, no plumbing, no phone reception. Just me, the woods, and the sound of my own breath. I didn't care. It was perfect. The man I'd bought it from, a wiry guy with hands cracked from years of outdoor work, had muttered something strange as he handed me the keys. "Don't wander the ring," he'd said. I laughed, thinking he meant the surrounding ridgeline, and he gave me a look that said I'd missed the point entirely. I didn't ask questions. Cheap land, no neighbors, end of story. The first week was uneventful. I settled into a rhythm. Chop wood, boil creek water, cook rice or beans, read tattered paperbacks I'd stuffed into my bag. For the first time in years, my brain felt quiet. The second week, though, I started noticing the rocks. They formed a rough circle maybe 30 feet from the cabin. Not a wall, just waist-high piles of stone like a broken necklace scattered in the weeds. At first, I thought they were old property markers, or the remnants of a fire pit, until I noticed the carvings. Not letters, not anything recognizable. Simple lines and hooks scratched deep into the granite. Some looked like antlers, others resembled closed eyes. I told myself it was Appalachian folk art, the kind of thing people did before Netflix existed. Then, one evening while straightening up the corner where I kept my pack, the floorboard gave under my heel with a groan. I pried it up and found a leather-bound book wedged in the dirt underneath. The cover was stiff and cracked like dried skin. No title, no name. The first few pages were plain enough. Canned goods tallies, dates of snowfalls, the kind of notes a hunter might keep. Then maybe 10 pages in, the handwriting tightened. October 14th, heard the steps again. Same pace as before. Always stop at the stones. I froze. It was too specific, too plain to be a joke. The entries grew stranger the deeper I read. November 3rd, a face at the glass. Looked like mine, but eyes wrong. Wouldn't blink. Copied me when I moved. I slid the book back under the floorboard and told myself I didn't care. That night I left the lantern burning until dawn. The noises started 3 nights later. Not banging, not scratching, just 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. 1 pause. 2 pause. 3. I'd been reading by lamplight, the book long forgotten, when the sound rattled through the wood. My breath stopped in my throat. I grabbed the axe I kept leaning against the cot and flung open the door. Nothing but moonlight silvering the stone ring. The trees were dead quiet, no wind, no owls. I locked the door, checked it twice, sat back down. Sleep didn't come. The next night, same time, the knocks returned. This time I didn't move. My hand whitened around the axe handle. 3 knocks, then silence. By the 3rd night, nerves shot, I stayed awake on purpose, lantern hissing. Around 2 in the morning, the 3 knocks came again. My skin prickled. Then I heard it, a voice. Not outside, not muffled, my voice. Exactly my voice. Down to the way it rose slightly at the end of sentences. "Ethan," it said, "you left the axe outside." My knuckles went numb. The axe was in my hand. "Bring the axe," it repeated. The tone wasn't angry or pleading. It was casual, conversational, the way I might remind myself I'd forgotten to turn off the stove. Then the footsteps began, soft, measured, circling the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They never crossed the stone ring. When morning finally came, I stumbled outside and found tracks in the frost. Bare feet, human but distorted. The toes stretched too long, the gaps too wide. They stopped at the stones, like the carvings had held them at bay. My stomach rolled. I dug the journal back out and read every frantic, half-legible page. The handwriting became desperate near the end. "They showed me my brother," it read, "but he didn't blink. Teeth wrong. Smile too wide." Another line, "They come in daylight now. Don't follow the false sun." The next week was torture. Every night the knocks came, always 3. Sometimes the voice called me by name. Sometimes it used other voices, my ex-wife's, my mother's. Each one perfect, each one wrong. Once it said, "Open the door, sweetheart. It's freezing out here." Another time, "You forgot your coat. Come fetch it." I stayed put, axe across my knees, lantern lit until the fuel nearly ran dry. Snow arrived early that year. One morning the woods looked painted in bone white, and the silence pressed heavier than ever. That was when I saw him, a figure at the edge of the trees, just beyond the stones. Same coat as me, same stance, same posture with hands tucked into pockets. My double, he didn't move, didn't wave. He just watched. I locked the door and peered through a crack in the curtain. He stayed until dusk, then was gone. The night after, the sound came from under the floorboards. Knock, 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 my chest constricted. Then the voice again, softer this time. "Ethan, the stove's dying. You'll freeze. Come down, I'll keep you warm." I pressed my palm against the axe head until it bit into my skin. Didn't move, didn't breathe. Dawn finally scraped through the windows and the knocking ceased. By then, I was unraveling. I packed my rucksack, shoved in the journal, my radio, and whatever food I could carry. On the emergency channel, I claimed chest pains, blurred vision. Anything to get a ranger dispatched. He agreed to meet me at the trailhead the following morning. That night was the worst of all. The faces came, not outside this time, at every window. My face multiplied, distorted. One bleeding from the nose. One with hair missing in clumps. One smiling with too many teeth. All staring, all unblinking. And one spoke in my mother's voice, tender and cruel. "Son, come out. Supper's ready." I held the axe, trembling, until daylight bled the images away. I left without looking back. Half ran, half stumbled down the trail, pack dragging me sideways. When the ranger met me, I must have looked like death itself. He asked what had happened, and I muttered something about a bear. He didn't press, but halfway down the trail he stopped and turned toward the woods. "You didn't leave anything behind, right?" His voice was steady, but his eyes kept scanning the tree line. I told him no, nothing. He gave a small nod. "Good," he said, "because I think it's walking behind us." I was 31 the first time I laid eyes on Crooked Spine Hollow, and by then, my life was already cracked beyond easy repair. I'd burned out on city work, night shifts at a warehouse where the fluorescent lights hummed like hornets, and managers barked orders in voices that reminded me too much of drill sergeants. After 2 near fights, 1 DUI, and a doctor telling me my liver numbers were heading somewhere ugly, I decided I needed air that didn't taste like brake dust and rage. My aunt passed that spring, and when her will turned up, so did the deed to an old single-wide trailer she kept in the hollow, tucked behind an abandoned strip mine. Nobody else in the family wanted it. They all called it the mistake lot, a scrap of land my aunt had bought on a whim when she was drunk at a county auction. They told me if I was desperate enough to use it, good luck. I didn't think twice. A free roof, even if it leaked, sounded like salvation. The drive out was punishing. Past the town of Talcott, the blacktop peeled into gravel, then rutted clay, then nothing but 2 tire grooves through brush so thick my truck's paint screeched like it was being peeled off. I parked when the road dissolved into mud and walked the last mile, my pack heavy with canned goods and coffee grounds. The trees swallowed me whole. Tall sycamores leaning at odd angles, pines sagging under the weight of moss. My only company was a mixed mutt named Crow, I'd picked up from the pound a year back. Crow had eyes like old pennies, bright but troubled. He followed at my heel, tail low, ears flicking at every branch snap. The trailer squatted in a clearing, tilted just enough that the porch steps sagged like crooked teeth. The siding had gone dull gray with weather and time, windows clouded by a film I couldn't scrub off with my sleeve. Inside, it smelled of mildew and cigarettes smoked decades ago. The floor dipped toward the bathroom, and in the back bedroom, the ceiling had caved in enough that insulation hung down like frozen curtains. Still, there was a stove, a bed frame, and 4 thin walls. It was more than I'd had in months. The first few days, I kept busy with repairs. I patched holes, nailed plywood over the soft spots in the floor, and hauled bags of garbage that had been moldering in the corners. My aunt had left behind yellowing magazines, half-empty bottles of cough syrup, and a cracked mirror. When I tilted it to the light, my reflection looked pale, worn thin, but almost relieved. Crow wasn't so easily convinced. He paced the hallway, whining when dusk fell, his eyes flicking always toward the west side of the hollow. That first week passed quiet. Too quiet, if I'm honest. Nights should have been thick with cicadas, frogs, and the skitter of raccoons. Instead, the hollow held itself still, like it was listening. The only sound was the creek that snaked along the ridge, its water gurgling low and steady. On the 5th night, just past 3 in the morning, a tapping woke me. Not a knock exactly, too faint. It sounded like wire poking against the siding. I told myself it was branches, but Crow was already up, stiff as a post, lips curled. I shined my flashlight through the blinds. Nothing. The beam cut the clearing open and found no deer, no coyote, no wind-moving branches. Just stillness. Crow growled low, then tucked his head against my knee, refusing to look outside again. The next night, the sound changed. A long, dragging scratch down the kitchen wall, like nails testing the metal skin of the trailer. It moved slowly, steady from back to front, pausing under the window before sliding further. Crow whined, pressed himself flat to the linoleum. I stood there gripping the hammer I'd left by the door, every muscle locked. After maybe a minute, the sound just stopped. Silence wrapped the place again. I slept with every light on, and even then my eyes refused to close. By the end of the week, gifts started appearing. A possum laid neatly on the porch, curled as though sleeping, though its eyes stared glassy at nothing. The following morning, it was a crow with wings folded tight as origami. No blood, no mess, just placed there. I buried them both by the creek, though my hands shook each time I held the shovel. Something about their bodies felt deliberate, like someone had posed them. The nights grew worse. A pale blur lingered in the trees west of the hollow. At first I thought it was fog-catching moonlight. Then it seemed to lean, to shift. Face maybe, or not a face at all. Just a smear of white that never moved, never blinked, always there. I started cooking my meals before dark, barricading the door with a chair, and shoving furniture against the windows. Crow sat with his head on my knee, trembling, staring at that same patch of trees. One morning, after a sleepless night, I stepped outside and found prints in the mud. Bare feet, almost human, but the toes stretched too long, the heels too narrow, like something trying to mimic us and missing. The tracks came in from the woods and ended at the trailer's wall. No returning path, just stopped there, inches from where I slept. When I went into town for supplies, I told the store owner, a man named Travis who'd lived in the county his whole life, what I'd been hearing. His face went blank, then serious. "That West Ridge?" he asked. I nodded. He shook his head slowly. "That don't belong to us. Best keep your eyes down and don't answer if it calls." I wanted to laugh, to press him for more, but the way his eyes slid past me said he wouldn't explain further. Back at the hollow, I borrowed one of his trail cameras and mounted it on a tree facing the clearing. That night, Crow refused to sleep. Around 2, my phone lit up. Shouldn't have, not in that dead zone, but a message appeared from no number. 4 words, "I see you now." My stomach collapsed. Crow growled, teeth bared, then bolted to the back door, barking at shadows. The scratching returned, only this time, it was everywhere. The roof groaned. The siding shivered as something scraped its length. A slam rattled the vent, followed by a dragging sound across the tin-like bone on metal. I ran through the trailer lighting burners, flames roaring blue. The glow wavered against the walls, and still the sound circled, faster, heavier, like something was running laps on all 4s. Then it stopped. Dead still, knocks followed. Slow, deliberate, 1, 2, 3. Crow whimpered. His ears tilted toward the front door, but his eyes darted toward the back window, as if he was hearing two things at once. I held the hammer, barely breathing. Another knock, gentler, patient. Then my name whispered, except it wasn't mine. It was my voice. "Jonah," it said. "You forgot your coat." The next day, my truck wouldn't start. Battery fine, tank half full, but not a click. I decided to leave on foot, pack slung over my shoulder, crow leashed tight. As we stepped onto the gravel road, Travis's pickup idled there, waiting. He leaned out the window. "You're not going back," he said. I shook my head. His gaze slid past me to the woods. "Good," he murmured. "Because once it knows you, it don't forget." At my sister's place in Beckley, I checked the trail cam before mailing it back. 6 photos, all time-stamped between 3:02 and 3:09 a.m. The first, the clearing, empty. The second, Crow sitting on the porch, ears up, tail stiff. Behind him, long fingers curling over the railing. The third, something crawling sideways up the siding, limbs bent backward, face turned toward the lens, though blank as bone. The fourth, the back door yawning wide open. Inside, a figure half-stepped across the threshold. Skin white and featureless, arms too long to be human. The fifth, nothing but the window, and in it my own reflection. But the eyes were wrong, hollow, too many shadows where pupils should be. The sixth, the lens itself obscured by a pale hand pressed against it from inches away. I deleted them all, smashed the card with a hammer, and tossed it into the creek behind her house. But some nights when I wake in the dead hours and hear a faint scratch at the siding, I remember what Travis said. Once it knows you, it doesn't forget. And sometimes when I pass a mirror in the half-dark, my reflection lingers a half-second too long, smiling when I don't. My name's Henry Porter. I'm 36 and I wasn't supposed to end up back in these mountains. I left McDowell County when I was 20, swearing I'd never return. But life doesn't care about oaths you make at bars to people who've long since forgotten your name. When my dad died, his place fell to me. A sagging cabin built into a slope off a logging road outside Panther Gap. Folks around here call it a hollow, but it feels more like a trap. The ridges curving in so tight the sky looks pinched. I didn't come back out of sentiment. My marriage had collapsed. My job at the tire plant evaporated. And I figured hiding out where no one could find me might give me a chance to breathe. The place leaned east. The porch groaned when I set foot on it, and half the roof shingles had blown into the yard. Dad always swore the house had bones, but to me it looked more like a skeleton about ready to give up. Still, it was free land, and for the first time in months I didn't hear traffic or see billboards. Just silence thick as a quilt. It had been 6 days when things went wrong. The first 5 passed slow. I fixed fence posts, patched leaks, and tried to relearn what it felt like to be sober. The days were hot, cicadas loud, and the air felt stuck in place. My generator wheezed on and off until it gave up altogether. I didn't mind. Quiet suited me. Then, on the 6th afternoon, I went out back to mend a section of fence the windstorm had knocked down. The boards were gray, soft with rot, but I figured they'd last another season if I propped them upright. I'd just braced one post when I heard it. Henry, drawn out like the speaker wasn't sure how to shape the syllables. Not shouted, not whispered. Just dropped into the air, wrong and flat, like a child practicing a new word. I froze, hammer in hand. Nobody calls me Henry around here. Family used to call me Hank. Friends just called me Porter. The only man who ever used my full name was my father, and he was 3 months in the ground. The voice came again. Farther off, warped like it was learning. "Help me." Henry, the trees didn't echo it. That was the first thing I noticed. Out here, even a cough bounces from ridge to ridge, carrying far longer than it should. But this voice landed heavy, swallowed whole, like the woods didn't want to share it. Against every instinct, I stepped past the broken fence into the timber. I didn't even grab my flashlight. My legs moved like they belonged to someone else. The path curved past an old creek bed, dry for years. Just as I crossed it, I spotted prints in the mud. Bare feet, too clean, too sharp-edged to be old. But wrong. Each foot had only 3 long toes. The prints stretched narrow like someone had tugged the feet into shape. They pointed uphill, toward the ridge we'd always been warned against. We called it the back line when I was a kid. Dad used to say, never cross that ridge. When I asked why, he'd go quiet, then change the subject. It wasn't superstition so much as certainty, like telling a child not to stick a fork in an outlet. You didn't need to know why, you just obeyed. But now the voice was calling me that way, tugging my chest forward. "Henry, help me." I followed. The woods opened into a clearing shaped too perfectly, as if someone had scraped it clean. No brush, no rocks, no deadfall, just leaves spread flat like a stage. At its center lay a mound of bones. I stopped at the tree line. At first glance, they looked like deer bones, scattered legs, ribs, spines bleached pale. But the longer I stared, the more I recognized shapes I shouldn't. A forearm, a femur too thick for any animal around here, ribs curved human-wide. No skulls, not one, my knees locked. I couldn't move. Then the voice came again, but closer. Too close. "Henry." Right behind me. I spun, nearly dropping the hammer. Nothing. When I turned back, the bone pile had shifted, like it had slumped or exhaled. And then something began to rise from behind it. It came together in pieces. A leg first, long and jointed wrong, bending too far. Then a torso stretched upward, unfolding slow until it stood taller than the pines. 8 feet, maybe more. Its skin hung like wax paper, too thin, stretched across shapes underneath. No eyes where eyes should be, just smooth skin. A mouth that didn't quite close. No teeth I could see, but I felt it watching me, direct as a spotlight. It tilted its head like a curious dog, and the spell broke. I ran. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my boots, but I didn't care. I rolled down a slope, slammed shoulder first into a stump, scrambled up again. My lungs tore, my heart hammered, and I didn't stop until I saw the faint yellow glow of my porch bulb cutting through the dark. I slammed inside, bolted every lock, shoved a chair under the knob, then sat on the floor clutching the hammer until dawn. Morning light made me doubt it. Maybe I'd dreamed half of it. Maybe grief and withdrawal had twisted me. But I went back, don't ask me why. Curiosity, maybe. Or stupidity. The clearing was still there, ringed by trees like before. But the bones were gone. Every last one. In their place, laid neat in the dirt, was my father's flannel shirt. The one he'd been buried in. Folded flat, clean, and beneath it, arranged in a perfect row, were teeth. Human teeth gleaming white, smiling up at me. I stumbled backward, shaking, and didn't stop until I hit the fence line. That night, I couldn't sleep. The generator kicked once, then died. Silence folded around me. And then 3 knocks. Not frantic, deliberate. I froze in the dark. Crow, my dog, lifted his head from the rug and stared at the front door, ears flat. Then came the voice. My father's this time. "Henry, you left the fence open." I gripped the hammer so hard my palms split. The knocks came again. 3. The next morning, I started packing. Whatever lived beyond that ridge had found me, called me by name, and left me gifts. And if there's one thing I know about these hollows, it's this. Once something calls you by name, it doesn't let go. I left the cabin with my pack slung over my shoulder, Crow pulling hard at his leash. Down on the road, Travis from the gas station slowed his truck beside me. "Headed out?" he asked. I nodded. He glanced toward the ridge. His face tightened. "Good," he said softly. Backline, don't forget a voice once it learns it. I didn't answer. But now, weeks later, even safe at my sister's in town, I hear it sometimes at night. A slow, deliberate knock on the siding, followed by a voice trying too hard to be mine. I wasn't born in the mountains, but I ended up stuck in them. After my divorce, I couldn't afford rent in Asheville anymore. So I rented a cabin that sat off a disused fire road above Red Lick, North Carolina. It was the kind of place that never showed up on GPS, unless you already knew the directions. The cabin leaned hard to one side, patched with tin siding, and the porch was nailed together from whatever planks the last tenant didn't bother hauling away. The landlord promised me cheap rent because no one else wanted to live that far from town. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolation, and space to get my head straight. By the time I moved in, most of the holler was empty. A few trailers sat half-collapsed along the road, swallowed by vines. The only thing still standing proud was the charred shell of an old store that had burned in the 70s. The place had a reputation, though locals never agreed on why. Some claimed people went missing up there because of bootleggers. Others whispered about an ashmouth that prowled the ridges at night, an old Cherokee tale about something that could burn through your lungs with a single breath. I never believed in mountain legends, but it didn't stop my spine from twitching when neighbors lowered their voices at the mention of it. At 35, I figured superstition was just something people leaned on to make sense of bad luck. My own bad luck was simpler: bills, court dates, and loneliness. I taught history part-time at a community college, grading essays about wars nobody remembered. The cabin was supposed to be my reset button, a place to prove I could live alone without falling apart. The first weeks weren't bad. I patched up leaks in the roof with tar, chopped wood from a downed oak, and even found a radio station that half worked if I bent the antenna just right. Nights were still, colder than I expected, but I grew used to the silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed in heavy, like the whole forest held its breath at once. That changed in early October. I stepped outside one morning and found every tool from the shed laid out across the frost-crusted ground, in a perfect line pointing toward the tree line. My hammer, wrenches, an old hatchet, even a bent screwdriver I hadn't touched in months, all spaced evenly, blades angled toward the woods. I stood there holding my coffee until it went cold, trying to come up with an explanation. Sleepwalking? Prank? I lived alone. No one should have been there. I shoved everything back inside, checked both padlocks, and told myself I'd been careless. But the next morning, they were back in that line. Only this time the hatchet was stuck into the chopping block so clean, it looked like someone had polished it. That night, I sat awake with my father's deer rifle across my lap, every lamp burning. I heard nothing, no footsteps, no cars on the gravel road, not even a coyote. Just stillness so sharp it made my ears ring. I stayed like that until the sun leaked pale and weak through the blinds. The second night, the sound began. A dragging noise in the dark, like someone pulling wet canvas over leaves. Then came the cracks of branches. Never the rhythm of walking, just single deliberate snaps, then silence, like it wanted me to know it was out there. I tried telling myself it was deer, but deer don't snap branches like knuckles popping. By the third night, the knocking started. Not at the door or windows, but against the far wall of the cabin. A low, hollow thud. One knock, wait, another, wait, always around 3 in the morning. I couldn't make myself go outside. I sat sweating in the dark, rifle aimed at nothing, counting the beats of my heart. By dawn, when I finally forced myself out back, I found tracks in the dirt, bare footprints. Human size, but the toes were too long, curved backward as if hooked. They trailed 5 steps into the woods and stopped dead. No drag marks, no exit. Just gone. The scratching came next. Nails, first light and tentative, like someone dragging twigs along the siding. Then more of them, higher and lower, circling the cabin. At one point, something heavy thumped against the wall hard enough to rattle a picture frame. By morning, I found carved marks gouged deep into the wood, symbols etched like writing in a language I'd never seen. Some burned as if the siding had been scorched from the inside out. I nailed every window shut, taped over vents, and draped the walls with quilts, trying to pretend I still had control. Didn't matter. It already knew I was there. A week later, I heard tapping at the propane tank out back. Slow, deliberate. I peeled back a strip of tarp over the window and nearly screamed. Something crouched there, pale as candle wax, bones jutting at odd angles under stretched skin. Its joints were wrong, bent too high, too sharp. One long finger tapped against the tank like a child testing glass. Then it stilled. Its head snapped toward me with an animal jerk, and though I dropped to the floor and pressed my face to the boards, I felt its attention like a weight pressing through the walls. The next morning, smeared prints trailed across the glass, greasy, elongated handprints with fingers like spider legs. Then came the voices. It started with my name whispered soft at the windows. Ethan, drawn out, cracked. The second night it used my voice, perfect, mocking. Ethan, come outside. The night after it whispered about the well. No one alive knew about that well. I'd buried my childhood dog there back in Ohio before I left home. The only other person who knew was my brother, and he'd been gone 6 years. From then on, it repeated things I'd said when I thought I was alone. Arguments I muttered under my breath. Secrets I'd never spoken aloud. all in my voice, twisting each word until it didn't feel like mine anymore. For 2 nights, everything went still, and I almost convinced myself it was over. Then I stepped out one morning and saw the cabin. Every inch of siding, every plank of the porch, the door, the railing, covered in carved symbols. Some shallow, some dug so deep they rusted the nails holding the boards. Others looked melted straight into the tin. The following night, I heard it on the roof. Scraping, dragging, each step deliberate, slow. I tracked it with my rifle from inside, step for step, until something heavy dropped onto the porch with a thud that shook dust from the ceiling. Then 5 knocks against the wall, and then a voice that wasn't mine, wasn't human, thick, wet, like teeth grinding underwater. "You breathe for me now." The doorknob rattled once and silence fell. In the morning, I found the knob slick with blood that wasn't mine. The generator quit that afternoon, its wires blackened as if cooked from the inside. I lit a candle and prayed. They came at midnight. Not one, but 4 or 5 of them, skittering around the cabin, pale limbs twitching at impossible angles. Every time one passed a window, a lullaby drifted in, sung in my mother's voice. The same cracked tune she used when I was small. Their bodies jerked like broken marionettes, shadows sliding wrong against the walls. I sat with the rifle until dawn, fingers shaking on the trigger, though I knew bullets wouldn't matter. I didn't sleep. I haven't since. The landlord called 3 days ago asking when I'd send the next rent check. I didn't tell him the walls are split with symbols that breathe when the air gets cold. I didn't tell him that sometimes when I glance in the cracked bathroom mirror, I see another face over mine, my own, but stretched too long, whispering the word ashmouth with a grin that isn't mine. I told him I'd mail the check soon. Then I hung up, sat on the floor, and listened to the knocking start again, slow and patient. I wasn't supposed to inherit anything from my father's side of the family, least of all land. They'd cut ties with us before I was born, so when a letter from some Backwoods attorney showed up in early 2019, I almost threw it in the trash. It said I'd been left property in Clay County, tucked somewhere in the ridges east of the Tug Fork. I didn't know the man who left it to me, my father's cousin, apparently, but the papers were signed and I was the only living blood close enough to claim it. At the time, I was 32, working nights at a hospital in Lexington, fried to the bone. After a 10-hour shift of fluorescent lights and bleeding alarms, the thought of solitude on a mountain trail felt like salvation. The city was too loud, too relentless, and the idea of a cabin where no one could page me, call me, or drag me into another crisis was irresistible. I packed light, some clothes, a rifle, my notebooks, a box of old medical texts I couldn't seem to part with, and drove south. My shepherd mix, Juniper, rode shotgun, her nose pressed to the glass. It took me the better part of a day to find the place. The trailhead wasn't marked on any map, and the dirt road had been choked nearly shut with kudzu and saplings. I parked where I could, dragged my gear by sled, and by evening I stood at the clearing. The cabin was old, but sturdier than I expected. A slate roof sagged in the middle, mossy timbers stitched it to the earth, and a spring house trickled faintly downhill. No wires, no plumbing, just a rectangle of rooms and a chimney blackened from decades of fires. I felt strangely at ease, like I'd stepped into a space that didn't belong to me but had been waiting all the same. The first weeks were quiet, almost idyllic. I fell into a rhythm, splitting logs, sweeping dust, cooking beans in the iron pot, and walking the slopes with Juniper. Nights cooled fast, stars crowding in so thick they made me dizzy. Sometimes, lying on the porch, I thought I could hear voices across the ridges, farm hands or hunters maybe. But when I tried to follow the sound, it melted into wind. It changed with the first tracks. I found them just beyond the spring house one morning, long, arched, bare footprints pressed deep into the mud. Too long to be human, with toes that curved slightly like a bird's talons but flat as if they'd carried weight. The stride was enormous, almost graceful, and Juniper refused to go near them. I crouched, studied them the way I used to study trauma cases, cataloging detail, measuring, searching for explanation. None came. I didn't tell anyone at first. When I drove into town for salt and nails, I mentioned it to a clerk, who only shrugged and said, "Probably kids fooling with you." Folks around here do that. But kids don't climb ridges barefoot in February, and kids don't leave prints stretching 3 feet apart. A few nights later came the knocks. 3 sharp raps on the back wall at nearly the same time every night, just past 2:30. The first night I bolted upright, hard hammering, rifle in hand. Juniper growled so low her body vibrated against the floorboards. I threw open the door, swept the lantern beam across the yard, and found only trees swaying under starlight. The knocks moved. One night from the roof, another from the porch, once even from the side of the spring house. Always 3, evenly spaced, deliberate. I checked for loose branches or boards shifting in the wind. Nothing. Then the roof creaked with actual steps. Slow, weighted. Someone or something was walking above me. My pulse thundered in my ears. I aimed the rifle straight up, finger tight on the trigger, waiting for shadow to drop through the ceiling. But the steps stopped, and the silence was worse than the sound. By the 3rd week, Juniper refused to step outside after sundown. She planted her paws at the threshold, hackles raised, staring into the tree line as if it were alive. She used to chase deer and bark at owls. Now she trembled at nothing I could see. One morning I discovered the shed unlocked, though I swore I'd bolted it. Inside, my tools had been rearranged into neat, eerie lines. The saws leaned together like soldiers. The hammer balanced perfectly on its head. My stethoscope, which I'd brought almost as a joke, lay coiled on the floor with the earpieces pointing at the door, as though whoever or whatever was arranging them wanted me to notice. I began chalking marks on the trees, just to make sure the woods weren't shifting when I wasn't looking. At first the marks stayed. Then one morning I saw an old pine bent nearly in half. Its top snapped forward as though bowing toward the cabin. Sap still dripped from the tier. I rigged motion lights, solar alarms, even strung old pie pans to clatter in the wind. For 5 nights, nothing. Then at exactly 2:14 one morning, every light died at once. The cabin dropped into a suffocating darkness, and I heard branches snapping at the edge of the yard. Juniper whimpered, tail tucked tight, and pressed her body against mine. The next day, 6 figures hung from the trees. Not bodies, but totems. Twigs lashed with sinew, feathers knotted around jawbones, rusted nails driven through bark. They stood in a crooked semicircle around the clearing, as though caging me in. I tore them down and burned them until they crumbled to ash. That night, the walls shuddered like something huge had rammed them. Jars toppled from shelves, firewood collapsed in a heap, and the roof trembled with weight. The dragging sound followed, something scraping down the siding, steady as breath. I stayed crouched with the rifle clutched so tight my knuckles burned. At dawn, I spotted them in the trees. Not men, not quite. Pale forms, tall and thin, limbs stretching too far. Faces shadowed, but heads cocked to the side like owls listening. They did not move, did not blink, only watched. I lifted the scope to look closer, but the longer I stared, the less their shapes made sense, like bones bending wrong beneath skin. When I lowered the gun, they were gone. I tried to leave. Packed supplies, lashed Juniper to my side, and hiked out along the trail. 2 miles in, I stumbled across more totems. These fresh, strung with bits of hide and bone. One spiral was braided with strips of leather so human it made bile crawl up my throat. I turned back. The truck wires had been stripped clean, copper veins torn out as though by surgical hands. The crank radio spat only static, and the batteries I'd stored for backup were drained as if something had swallowed their charge. I barricaded the doors, nailed planks across the windows, and waited. The whispers started at 2. Soft, circling, too many voices to count. Not language, not sound I could trace, but an intimate murmur brushing against the walls. Juniper soiled herself and lay shivering on the floor. My throat ached from thirst, yet I didn't dare open the door. By morning, I saw the trees had bent again, 4 of them crooked sharply inward, as though the forest itself were folding around me. I was running out of options. I stripped metal panels from the old truck bed, fashioned a crude sled, and wired the winch to the solar rig. The final night, I sat with lanterns burning, rifle on my knees, waiting for whatever would come. At 3 o'clock sharp, the floor began to hum. Not quake, not creak, hum like a low frequency vibrating through the bones of the cabin. My teeth rattled, then crunching, circling the house, heavy, deliberate, yet never stepping into view. They rounded the cabin 3 times before stopping. At 3:27, Juniper's ears shot up and she growled at the ceiling. I heard breath. Not mine, not hers. Wet, rattling breath just above us. I fired into the roof. The blast shook dust from the rafters. A hiss followed, like steam escaping from flesh, and something launched off the far side, crashing into brush. I didn't wait to confirm. By sunrise, I loaded what little I could onto the sled, strapped Juniper tight, and hauled down the slope with the winch groaning. It took half a day to reach gravel. At the edge of the clearing, I made the mistake of looking back. Something stood in the trees. Tall, pale, head tilted, watching, waiting. I never returned. The papers are still in my name. The property still listed as mine. But the cabin is no longer a place I own. It owns itself. And some nights, in my small apartment back in Lexington when the clock strikes 2:14, I swear I hear 3 knocks at the wall, patient, deliberate, reminding me they have not forgotten where I am. I was 29 the year I left Louisville behind, and ended up in that cabin outside Irwin, tucked in a stretch of Unicoi forest that didn't appear on most maps. People talk about starting fresh like it's some noble choice, but for me, it was closer to running away. My residency in the city hospital had fallen apart. I'd burned through a relationship by neglect and sleeplessness, and the only thing I was sure of was that I didn't want anyone to recognize me anymore. The place came through an estate listing with barely a description, just coordinates, a grainy photograph of a leaning shack, and the phrase secluded, cash only. That was the hook. No address, no realtor's office, just an invitation to disappear. I pulled savings I shouldn't have touched, stuffed my Corolla with a box of medical books, some old camping gear, a cast iron skillet, and my mutt Roscoe, then drove until the road turned into mud. The last half mile I dragged my belongings on a sled, improvised from a shipping pallet. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron. When I finally saw the cabin, my first thought was that it looked tired of existing. Gray boards slumped on a slope, a tin chimney jutting crooked as a broken tooth, and blackberry brambles clutching at the porch steps. It was perfect. The first week was an exhale I hadn't known I'd been holding. No pager, no alarms, no sharp smells of antiseptic and rot, just wood smoke curling into the cold and Roscoe trotting the ridgeline. I read by lantern light, scrawled in notebooks, and listened to the scratchy voices of preachers and crooners on a secondhand radio. The silence pressed in heavy, but for once it didn't feel like suffocation. On the 9th night, it changed. I'd just drifted off when something tapped the wall above my head. Not a branch, not a settling board. 3 clear knocks spaced like punctuation. Roscoe snapped awake, his growl low enough to buzz the floorboards. I held the lantern out into the black, heart rattling, and saw only a wall of trees staring back. It came again the next night, but from the opposite side of the cabin. Always 3 knocks, always around 2 in the morning. By the 3rd time, I stopped pretending it was coincidence and sat upright in my bag with the hatchet balanced across my knees. The forest grew stranger, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. In the mornings, I'd find rocks stacked on the path, small towers balanced too precisely to be an accident. I knocked them down with a boot, but they returned each night in new patterns. Sometimes spiraled, sometimes in jagged lines pointing toward the cabin. Roscoe avoided them completely, skirting wide arcs as if they were hot. On the 12th night, the knocks didn't stop at 3. They circled the cabin, tap on the west wall, tap on the north, tap on the porch posts. Faster, closer, until it felt like the whole structure was vibrating. I pressed my palms against the boards and felt the rhythm run through the wood into my bones. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. I tried to laugh it off the next morning, but when I opened the door, a crow hung from a nail in the nearest hickory. Wings spread, body gutted, head turned so its beak pointed at the cabin. Below it, scratched deep into the bark, were the words, "We told you." I nearly left then, but the truck was useless. The tires had been cut through, not slashed wild, but sliced clean, straight as a scalpel. The ignition wires dangled, copper stripped. No coyote did that. No person should have been able to do it without leaving prints. Yet the mud was untouched, so I stayed. What else could I do? I boarded the windows, fed the stove until sparks climbed into the rafters, and tried not to think. The voices came a week later. At first I thought it was the radio bleeding static, but when I shut it off, the murmuring didn't stop. They were outside, drifting just beyond the walls, rising and falling in cadences like bedtime stories. I pressed my ear to the floor and realized they were circling, just as the knocks had, telling stories in a language I couldn't parse. Every few lines, laughter, a soft, wet sound like someone chuckling into cupped hands. Roscoe whined, belly to the floor, and wouldn't move until dawn. When the sun came, I found a ring of teeth scattered across the porch. Not all human, not all animal. Molars, canines, cracked incisors, some with roots still crusted in gum. They were arranged in a perfect circle, points facing inward. I started walking out then, didn't even bother packing. I shoved Roscoe ahead of me and followed the ridge east until I hit barbed wire, then traced it until I stumbled on a field. A farmer found me there 2 hours later, face cut up from briars, voice raw. I begged him to drive me into town. 2 days later, I came back with a tow truck and a deputy from the county. We hiked the trail in silence, my stomach clawing itself with each step. The cabin stood just as I'd left it, but when the deputy swung the door wide, the inside was stripped bare. The mattress, the stove, the shelf, my books, even Roscoe's dish. Gone. The only thing left was the hearth. Inside it, carefully stacked, was a pyramid of small bones blackened with heat. At the top of the pile sat my lantern. Glass soot-stained, wick curled, glowing faintly though I hadn't filled it in days. The deputy stared too long. Then he muttered almost to himself, "Another one." I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. I left the mountain that evening with the truck groaning behind us. I've never set foot back there, never even looked at that stretch of map again. But some nights, usually when I'm close to sleep, I hear it again. 3 deliberate knocks against the wall. Not memory, not dream. Always at 2 in the morning. Always the same rhythm. And when I check, Roscoe's already awake, staring at the door, tail tucked tight, waiting for it to start again. I was 28 when I walked away from everything and ended up in a half-rotted shack on the far side of Brushy Fork Ridge, West Virginia. My life in Charleston had collapsed in that slow, grinding way where every choice feels like a mistake. Bartending shifts bleeding into debt, friendships turning sour, a relationship that ended with a slammed door and a voicemail I still haven't listened to. I didn't know what I wanted, only that it wasn't there. A posting on a faded bulletin board outside a laundromat caught my eye. Cabin rental, remote, cheap cash. No number, just an address scrawled on the bottom of the slip. I tore it off like it was fate, though I don't believe in that kind of thing. The man who answered the door when I knocked looked carved out of bark. He introduced himself as Vern, said he managed a few places out past the ridge. His hands shook when he pulled a brass key from his pocket. He didn't ask for a deposit or even my last name, just took the first month's rent in wrinkled bills and muttered, "Keep the hatch shut. Always keep it shut." I assumed he meant the outhouse. He didn't. The road out was barely a road at all, more of a washed-out vein of gravel that my Civic barely crawled along before giving up. I had to drag the rest of my things in by hand, 2 duffel bags, a box of canned food, and Roscoe, my old mutt, who seemed uneasy the moment we set foot past the tree line. The shack wasn't a house by any stretch, more like a storage shed someone had once lived in, and then abandoned to sag into itself. The roof was tin-patched with tar, streaked orange where rain had rusted through. The floor leaned toward the back wall so badly that my chair slid an inch every time I sat down. The single window was cracked down the middle like a frozen spiderweb, and when the wind pushed through, it made the glass hum like a bottle rim. Inside, there was a cot with a lumpy mattress, a wood stove coated with soot, and a shelf nailed crooked against the wall. No plumbing, no electricity, not even a well, just a rain barrel angled toward the sink. Behind the shack, on a slope choked with weeds, sat a warped outhouse. Its door leaned sideways as though it had been hit hard and never recovered. Beneath the shack itself, hidden under a splintering hatch, was a crawl space that smelled of damp earth and iron. That was the part Vern must have meant. I wedged it shut with a block of firewood, more for mice than monsters. The first week was quiet. Hard, yes, but quiet. I chopped kindling, hauled water, cooked noodles over the stove, and fell asleep with my boots still on. Roscoe sniffed the corners uneasily, but seemed to settle once I kept the lantern lit. The only sound at night was the wind combing through the ridge, which sometimes fooled me into thinking someone was walking just out of sight. It was the second week when things shifted. One morning, a smooth gray stone sat dead center on the porch rail, about the size of a fist, round as though it had been polished by river water. I assumed it had rolled off the roof or been tossed by a kid, though I hadn't seen a house for miles. I pitched it into the brush and thought nothing more. The next morning, another stone. Same size, same place, balanced so perfectly it looked staged. By the third, I couldn't ignore it. I walked a perimeter, scanning for tracks, but the dirt showed nothing but my own boots and Roscoe's paw prints. When I stopped at the general store in town for kerosene, I asked the owner, a stern woman named May, if kids ever came out near Brushy Fork to mess with folks. She froze, a jar of pickles in her hand, and said only, "If there's ever 3, you don't stay to see the rest." Then she changed the subject. Her warning stuck with me, though I pretended it didn't. That same week, I felt eyes on me while chopping wood, the kind of stare that tightens the back of your neck. I turned and caught the faintest glimpse of something pale between the trees. Too tall for a deer, too still for a person. I blinked and it was gone. I worked with my back against the shack after that, Roscoe growling low until nightfall. The noises began on a cold Tuesday. Light thuds on the roof, like someone scattering handfuls of dirt. The next night came the scraping, slow, deliberate, something dragging across tin. I climbed onto the roof with my flashlight, but there was nothing. No claw marks, no branches, just silence pressing so hard it rang in my ears. Then came the humming. It started faint, a tuneless sound drifting up from behind the shack. Not music exactly, just a breathy rhythm, like someone trying to recall a lullaby they'd half forgotten. I stepped outside with my lantern, sweeping the beam over the outhouse, the rain barrel. The trees, nothing. But when I blew out the flame and went inside, the humming resumed, closer this time. Roscoe pressed against the door, whining so sharp it shook his ribs. The next night it wasn't humming. It was whispering, not words I could understand, only a hissed cadence circling the shack, weaving in and out of the cracks in the wood like smoke. I sat rigid on the cot with the hatchet across my knees, eyes darting to the hatch in the floor. It creaked once, then slammed shut again. At dawn, I pried it open and shined my flashlight inside. What I saw carved dread into me, scratches, dozens of them, clawed deep into dirt and wood, wild and frantic. Some fresh, the wood pale where it had been ripped. Something had been trying to get out. From that day, I couldn't bring myself to use the outhouse. I pissed in bottles, taped blankets across the windows, and kept the fire low so no light spilled outside. I slept in my boots, the hatchet tucked under my coat, counting the rocks each morning. On the 18th night, I peeled back a corner of the towel over the window. 3 figures stood at the tree line. Tall, thin, skin pale as bone, faces darkened with streaks of something I couldn't name. Ash paint, blood, it didn't matter. They didn't move. They only faced the shack as if waiting. On the porch rail below them, balanced neatly in a row, were 3 stones. I froze, hand on the glass, lungs locked. Roscoe's hackles rose and he pressed into my legs so hard it hurt. I didn't dare breathe. When morning finally came, they were gone. So were the stones. That was the night the generator failed. No warning, no sputter. Just silence so heavy it seemed to smother the fire itself. I lit a candle, but the shadows seemed wrong, too long, bending toward the hatch. The humming rose again, not outside this time. Beneath me, the hatch creaked open. Just a sliver at first, enough to let the damp smell of earth rise. Then a sound, slow, wet breathing dragging across the crawl space. Roscoe whimpered, belly flat to the floor. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I sat like a corpse until dawn, staring at that crack. When the sun rose, I slammed it shut, nailed it down with every spike I had, packed my bag, and left everything else. I hiked the 5 miles out without stopping once, Roscoe dragging at the leash until we reached the road. I never saw Vern again. Months later, in a bar 3 towns over, I overheard a man talking about Brushy Fork Ridge. Said folks out there used to whisper about the hollow folk, pale things that left stones on your porch as a count. First one meant you'd been noticed. Second meant you'd been measured. Third meant they were ready to step inside. No one ever saw 4. I don't know if I believe that. But sometimes in the dead middle of the night, when the apartment is still, and Roscoe lifts his head to stare at nothing, I swear I hear it again, the soft creak of a hatch easing open, and the low hum of a song no human throat should carry. I was 32 in the summer of 2016 when I left Cincinnati, and wound up renting a place on the far side of Mingo County, tucked in a spur of the Tug Fork Hills where the asphalt gave up and gravel tried its best. I wasn't running from the law or hiding from debt, though God knows both had crossed my mind before. It was simpler than that. My teaching contract at the high school hadn't been renewed. My marriage had ended in a kitchen argument that never cooled, and the city had shrunk down into a cage of concrete and fluorescent light. When you've lost the people who anchored you, quiet starts to sound like a cure. The house came cheap through a man named Harper, who owned too much land to bother remembering it all. He looked at me the way a farmer looks at a busted fence post, like I'd do until something better came along. He handed me a key across the hood of his truck and said, "It'll keep you dry, but don't wander the ridge after dark. Things up there don't forget when they've been called." I laughed because I thought it was small-town superstition, the kind of thing people say to remind outsiders they don't belong. He didn't laugh back. The place was a leaning single story with a tin roof that groaned in the heat. The porch slanted toward the drop-off, boards spongy under my boots. The windows were so filmed with dust they blurred daylight, and the back door swelled tight in its frame. Still, it had power, running water, and, most importantly, nobody else for half a mile. I set down my mattress in the living room, stacked my boxes of books against the wall, and told myself the silence would save me. For 3 nights it did. I drank cheap beer on the porch, watched lightning bugs burn over the fields, and let my mind go blank. On the 4th night, I woke up just after 2, not to a sound, but to a pressure. My body snapped awake as if someone had leaned close to whisper my name. The room felt smaller, heavy with air. I lay still until my ears caught it. Low voices outside, not a conversation I could follow. More like a chant muttered too soft to make sense. I rose, cracked the door, and let the night pour in. The yard was empty, the ridge still as painted canvas. The sound vanished the instant I opened the door. The next morning I convinced myself it had been a dream. By the following week I knew better. Handprints appeared on the back window, long wet smears, 5 fingers dragging down the glass. They were higher than I could reach without standing on a chair. I wiped them away with a rag. But the next evening they returned, lower this time, as though whatever made them had crouched to watch me. When I called Harper and asked if anyone had been nosing around the property, he gave me a pause so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then he said, "No, and if you hear whistling, don't answer." Before I could press him, he hung up. That night it came. 4 notes drifting from the woods behind the house, high, high, low, low, thin as breath through a flute. At first I thought I'd imagined it, until Roscoe, my hound, lifted his head and whined. Against all reason I whistled it back. The woods swallowed my reply, and for a heartbeat nothing moved. Then the same 4 notes returned, closer, as though whatever had played them was walking toward the house. I killed the lights, crouched in the hallway with a hammer across my lap, and waited until dawn. The morning showed me tracks in the mud near the shed. Bare prints, but wrong. 7 long toes spread wide, each pressed deep as though the thing had weighed twice what I did. I photographed them, showed a man at the hardware store in town. He laughed at first, then his smile dropped. "Don't stir what ain't meant to be stirred," he muttered, sliding the photo back without meeting my eyes. By the 2nd week, the knocks began. Always 3. Never on the door, always on the back wall that faced the ridge. I stopped running out with my flashlight after the first time showed me nothing but silence pressed so thick it felt alive. Instead, I dragged the couch across the room, nailed the back window shut, and left the television buzzing static through the night. Because somehow the hiss felt less empty than quiet. That was when the dream started. A woman always at the edge of the tree line, skin too pale to belong under the sun, hair plastered to her face as though she'd climbed out of water. Her dress was torn at the hem, clinging to her legs. She never spoke. She only raised one hand and pointed toward the ridge. Her mouth moved soundlessly, and when I tried to look where she gestured, I always woke up choking, my throat raw as though something had pressed its fingers there in my sleep. Days blurred together. I drank more than I ate. I kept the shotgun against the wall by the bed, the hammer by the stove. Every knock, every whistle, every dream carved deeper into my nerves until my hands shook even when nothing was happening. Out of desperation, I borrowed trail cams from a man at work and strapped them to trees around the property. For 4 nights, they recorded only squirrels and shadows. On the 5th, one camera vanished. I found it 30 feet from where I'd mounted it, strap shredded, plastic cracked down the middle as though it had been twisted by enormous hands. Not chewed, not dropped. Torn apart, I decided to leave that night. I packed light, shotgun, duffel, and dog, and drove down the mountain road. 2 miles out, the tires gave. Not one, not two, all 4. A hiss like someone slowly letting out air followed me until the truck lurched to a stop on its rims. I slept with the gun across my lap, Roscoe whining against the seat, and when dawn broke, I flagged a tow from the next town. The driver eyed me and asked where I'd come from. When I told him, his face tightened. I don't go past that bend. Hook it yourself if you want. He stayed in the cab, engine idling, eyes locked on the tree line while I chained the truck. I holed up in town for 2 days, convinced myself stress had broken me. But my welding rig was still back at the house and it was worth too much to abandon. So against every instinct, I went back in daylight. The door stood ajar. I know I had locked it. Inside, the air was colder than outside, heavy, unmoving. My duffel lay dumped out, books scattered. But the strangest thing was on the mattress. My welding mask, placed upright like a face staring at me. Inside it, a tooth. Human, yellowed, too large to belong to a child. On the wall above the bed, scrawled in dried mud, was a single word. Stay, I didn't. I walked out, shut the door behind me and left everything, tools, books, clothes rot where they sat. Sometimes late at night in my apartment in Huntington, I'll hear those 4 notes again. High, high, low, low, threading through the hiss of traffic outside my window. Roscoe hears it too. He lifts his head, ears flat, eyes fixed on the door, and I don't dare whistle back. I was 27 the year I took over a cabin near Panther Creek in eastern Kentucky. My father's brother, Earl, had lived there for most of his life until a stroke claimed him in the living room. No one else in the family wanted the land. It was 20 acres of tangled woods, a half-choked pond, and a cabin that looked like it had sagged under its own memories. When the lawyer called, I had just been laid off from a machine shop job in Hazard, with rent 2 weeks overdue and nothing left to sell. It felt less like a choice and more like inevitability. The place was worse than I remembered. Siding warped and spotted with mildew, roof pocked with rust holes, porch slanting hard to the left. The inside smelled like damp carpet and ashes. The wallpaper peeled in strips, and when I opened the closet, I found a nest of twigs and bird bones tucked against the hot water heater. No cell signal, no internet, just a structure and a stretch of woods that swallowed you whole the moment you walked beyond the yard. Still, it was mine, free, and when you're desperate, that's enough to make you hopeful. For the first week, I worked hard, trying to pretend it could be a beginning. I patched roof seams with tar, boiled pond water, mapped out where I might raise chickens. At night, I sat on the porch with a flashlight and a battered paperback, the forest pressing close but quiet. It was rough living, but it was steady, and I told myself I could manage. That illusion ended on the 8th night. I woke with no reason at exactly 2:19 a.m., my eyes snapping open like someone had whispered into them. My body felt charged, every muscle braced. A moment later, a sound came from the kitchen window. 5 knocks. Even deliberate, I sat frozen. When I finally forced myself to look, I saw condensation on the glass, and 5 clear circles where something had tapped. I opened the door, shined my flashlight, but the yard was still, the pond black as tar. The next night it came again. Same time. This time at the back door. 5 knocks, a pause, 5 more. I flung the door open to nothing but cold air. The grass under my bare feet felt strangely warm, as if coals smoldered just beneath the soil. By the 3rd night, I was waiting. Mug of instant coffee, flashlight in hand. At 2:19, the bathroom wall thudded with the pattern. Not the door, not the window, inside. I yanked the curtain back in time to watch it sway as though someone had brushed it. The tub was empty. The air reeked of damp iron. Sleep stopped being an option. I scavenged plywood from the shed, boarded up the windows, left the porch light on through the night. I sat awake with my father's hunting knife across my lap, every nerve stretched to the breaking point. On the 5th night, the back door shuddered as if something heavy leaned against it. The plywood groaned. Then from the other side, a voice, whispered but clear as breath in my ear, "Let us see your eyes." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It spoke like it knew me, like it had been waiting long before I arrived. I didn't move until daylight. The next morning I drove into town, desperate for someone to talk to. At a bait shop in Harlan, I asked the old man behind the counter if he'd ever heard of strange things up by Panther Creek. He stopped bagging minnows, studied me, then muttered, "That's where the revival burned." He told me about a church in the 1930s, a snake-handling congregation that had taken to fire rituals. One night the place went up in flames, 17 dead. When they dug through the ashes, they said bones older than the church itself were buried under the floor. Human bones, not the kind that belonged to a congregation. Folks whispered that the fire hadn't been an accident, that the ridge had taken back what was its due. I left without buying bait. For 2 nights I slept in my truck behind a Dollar General. When I finally worked up the nerve to return, I found the plywood gone from the windows, though no one had forced the door. Inside everything was rearranged. The kitchen cabinets hung open. The mattress was flipped upside down, and on the floor, my uncle's old Polaroids, hunting shots, family gatherings, trees in the yard were laid in a circle. In half of them, someone else appeared. A long, thin shape crouched at the edge of the frame, just over his shoulder. Its outline was almost the same as mine. That night, I set up a trail camera in the hallway. At 2:19, the lights flickered like a blink. Then 5 knocks rattled the wall outside my bedroom. Something scraped across the floorboards. The camera clicked once. In the morning, I checked the footage. At 2:15, the feed cut to static, returning 10 minutes later. The frame showed me asleep, sprawled on the mattress. And in the doorway stood a figure, my height, my hair, my clothes, my face. Except for the eyes, which were bottomless black. I couldn't look for more than a second. I packed my things in minutes, shoving clothes into bags, dragging them to the truck. As I drove away, I glanced back. The boards on the windows were gone again, as though I'd never nailed them. I rented a cheap room in Manchester under a fake name, the kind with orange carpet and a rattling air unit that never cooled the air. For the first time in days, I slept until 2:19. I woke freezing. The AC was dead, the room stifled. I walked to the mirror above the sink. My breath fogged the glass, but then a new print smudged across it, as though a finger traced from the other side. 3 days later, my phone rang from a blocked number. I answered, no voice, just breathing. Then finally, the same whisper I'd heard through the back door. "Come back. Let's finish." Against my own reason, I returned. I told myself I'd burn the place if I had to. The front door stood wide open. The house was colder than the air outside. The mattress was shredded, scattered with gray ash. The kitchen table was flipped on its back, legs twisted upward like broken arms. In the sink, my boots soaked in clean water as though waiting to be worn. My hands shook as I picked up the trail cam from the porch. I powered it on. The first frame was the empty hallway. The second was the figure stepping closer. Same jacket, same jeans, same crooked smile, my smile. Only the eyes were molten, black swallowing the whites. 5 knocks sounded behind me, soft, certain. I spun. Nothing but the hum of the fridge. I bolted. Bag in hand, I sprinted to the truck, jamming the key in the ignition. The engine stuttered, refused, then caught. As I pulled down the drive, I looked once at the cabin window. Something was crawling across the glass. Not walking, crawling, elbows and knees bent wrong. Head twisted sideways, lips peeled back too wide. It grinned. My grin, I never went back. But some nights when the clock clicks past 2:19, I hear it again. 5 knocks, steady as a heartbeat, waiting for me to answer.